Is there anything more we could have done in the case of Fairview Arena in terms of inspections, or anything more we should be doing going forward in inspections of these kinds of facilities?
So we're studying what happened there now, as also doing a proactive review. What we really should remember, though, is this is a case where the system worked, where an inspection showed us on Monday there might be a problem, we evacuated, and thank goodness there was no one there. And ultimately, this really talks to the importance of something I've been talking about since I've been in this job, which is life cycle maintenance and making sure that we are looking after all of our city facilities. And we've done a really good job of highlighting that and also putting money towards it. And highlighting with our funding partners of the provincial and federal governments how important this is. Because often fixing a roof isn't as sexy as building a new facility, but you got to fix the roof. You got to clean up the locker rooms. And that's why when we developed our community infrastructure fund when I first became mayor, 50% of it had to go to life cycle maintenance. So this is actually a very important policy issue. I can't speak to this particular thing and what happened because we just don't know yet. But I can say making sure that all of our assets are in good repair is something that's very important to the city of Calgary, and frankly, I think we do a better job of that than many other governments.
Should we be worried about other facilities in the city, the other old arenas? The Mount Pleasant Arena is a pretty aged building. There's a few others like it.
No one needs to worry about anything because, as I said, this is an example of the system working and working well. But that said, we will continue to be proactive and making sure that we catch this stuff before it happens.
Now, this meeting today,
this is unbelievably important.
Development for Dummies, what is the layman's explanation for what the city administration is proposing and what the development community wants?
For many years, we had a situation of what I used to call the sprawl subsidy, which was an implicit subsidy from the city budget of new growth in the suburbs. And we managed to get rid of the sprawl subsidy on the capital side. So new neighborhoods now, by and large, pay for their growth in terms of physical things we have to build. Bridges, roads, fire halls, things like that. However, we did not solve the problem on the operating side. So when you have a new neighborhood, you need to have firefighters, you need to have buses. And until that neighborhood is built out, the taxes that the neighborhood pays don't cover the cost of having the firefighters and the police officers and the bus drivers and so on in that neighborhood. And so what we're discussing today is, well, how should that be paid for? Because we know that we need to bring new neighborhoods online as our economy recovers and our population increases. But should every taxpayer have an increase in their taxes to pay for those bus drivers and firefighters in those new neighborhoods, or somehow should the people who live in those neighborhoods pay for it, or should the developers pay for it up front? So that's really what we're talking about. And what administration is saying is, we've tried hard to find a new mechanism. We haven't really found one that we think will work, but we recognize that we've got to get some new neighborhoods online. So they are suggesting that in the first instance, we keep on with the old system, which is that we cover that cost across the whole city. And the developers are saying that's okay, so it helps us get some stuff online. But we are also looking to continue the conversation to find a better way to do it, and that sounds reasonable to me.
And it looks like normally it looked like a few ASPs, but now you're looking at what, fast tracking 6 to 12 communities?
Yeah, that's not particularly out of the norm. So, before I became mayor, I was very critical of the fact that we had too many communities being built in every part of the city. We couldn't cover the costs, and it took a long time for the communities to be done. So for the people who live there, they waited a long time for transit and better road connections and so on. So at its peak, we were building 43 communities at a time. Right now, we're building 21. And the industry seems to say somewhere between 20 and 25 is the right number. They're just worried that of the 21 that are being built now, a lot of them will be done soon. And so they have to be replaced, and the administration agrees with that.
I thought it was close to up to double the amount of communities per cycle. If you look at it from 2 to 3 ASPs to...
No, so this is where it gets confusing. ASPs are really big, and they can have multiple communities in them.
Yes.
And so we're
but it was
trying
up to 6 to 12 communities,
Yeah,
right?
so we're trying to look at communities instead of the ASPs. In the old days, we did it by ASPs. Okay. So you did huge chunks in the first place. Mm-hmm. What's being asked for is basically staying with about what we have now and a little bit more, but remembering that a lot of neighborhoods like Auburn Bay, for example, are almost done. And so those have to be replaced in order to even keep what we have now, and probably a few more over that as the population grows.
Were you convinced by the industry's case that there's the demand for this and that it needs to be facilitated?
This is actually, this is a tough one, because you want to allow the market to work as much as possible, but there are some places where regulation is required, because this is not a place where the free market works easily. I cannot buy a neighborhood, I can only buy a house. And so I have to choose a house within the neighborhoods that are on offer, which is why it makes sense for government to have some regulation around this. That said, we also have to believe in private sector market forecasts. So of course, if you're a developer, you're going to have the rosiest possible forecast. If you're a regulator, you're going to have the smallest possible forecast, and the answer is always somewhere in the middle. That said, I am optimistic about where our economy is, about in-migration, and certainly the numbers look like they will end up being higher than the city's forecast. So the city themselves commissioned a private sector forecaster to check our numbers. So we know the range of the deficit of single detached homes and semi-detached homes going forward in the next budget cycle will be somewhere between 2,000 and 7,000 homes, which sounds like a big range, but can probably be managed within whatever we come up with.
How real is the concern that development will go to Airdrie, Rocky View, Foothills County, or Edmonton, Winnipeg?
Well, if it goes to Edmonton or Winnipeg, that's kind of a red herring, because that has nothing to do with population growth in our neighborhood. You know, capital is mobile, so it moves around. The real question is, how do we manage growth within our own region? And we've seen that the split of development between us and the neighboring communities has been pretty standard at about 80-20, 80% in Calgary, 20% in neighboring communities over the last several years. I'm not actually worried about that, because those neighborhoods, those cities, communities around us, your Airdrie, your Cochrane, and so on, have their own growth plans. And I'm not interested in getting into a race with them to try and steal development from one another. So I'm actually not that fussed about that. And quite bluntly, purely residential development might work better in some cases in those neighborhoods, because for us, we know that pure residential development that doesn't come with jobs ends up costing every taxpayer money. So that's really, it's a bit, the argument is a bit of a red herring in my opinion.
So to clarify, the option 1B is basically status quo.
Status quo, but with some new neighborhoods, and then we'll just have to figure out how to pay for it.
And that comes back in June.
Well, it'll come back several times. We have to have a conversation around basically three things. Number one is service standards. So we've been talking about, you know, is the 7-minute fire response the right thing? So we're going to continue having that conversation. Number two is which neighborhoods, because we can talk about this in isolation, but remember, it's not an issue of money. There are three things. It has to meet the city's growth plans. It has to meet market forecasts, and we have to have the money for it. So we have to look at the various neighborhoods that are being proposed and say which ones actually make sense for the city. You know, if we build one, for example, that might be isolated on the other side of Stony Trail where nothing will ever be built around it and we'll never be able to provide transit, even if we've got the money for it, it may not make sense to build that one. Whereas if there's one where, you know, it's integrated with employment and very well integrated with the transit network and the road network, that one may make more sense. So we have to make those decisions. That's number two, and then number three, we got to figure out how to pay for it. So between now and November, we're going to have multiple opportunities to have those discussions.
Some of the questions from councillors are pretty pointed. Is this like a inner city versus sprawl issue, or?
No. However, what's a nice way of saying this? There's no nice way of saying this.
Oh.
It points to other cleavages ideologically within the council, not necessarily inner city versus suburban. That said, I'm pretty satisfied that at the end of this, council will come up with a decision that almost everyone will agree with.
Why are they twisting themselves in such knots for considering what's up for today?
Sometimes you got to play to the fences. Sometimes you got to, stand up in front of the crowd and make sure that the audience is hearing what you need them to hear.
So is this about like suburbs versus densification kind of thing?
No. You'll figure it out.
To what extent can we see this in many ways, what Bill is bringing forward and the city with them as well to an extent? Is this a reaction to the conversation we had 2 years ago? instituting offsite?
It's not a reaction to, but it is the necessary and expected continuation of that discussion. When we increase the offsite levies, ending the sprawl subsidy, we also said, but we have to talk about the operating cost. And so we set up this working group deliberately to have this conversation. I think everyone's a bit frustrated that it's taken as long as it has. But in the end, what's funny about this long conversation is we actually had Bill stand up and say, yeah, I agree with the administration's recommendation, but please send us a way to try and come up with a better one. And no one's going to disagree with that. I'd be surprised if there's a single vote against that. But we've got to make our way through the discussion to get there.